Hello folks, Dead Set here, and today is going to be one of my mini departures from what I usually discuss, which is 3D art and basically how to animate in my chosen program, Lightwave 3D. In this departure, I'm going to be doing a movie review, and I've only done one movie review, series review here, and that was The Rings of Power, which I was just, let's just say my level of disappointment was high, as was lots of people. Well, today is not going to be any better. I recently watched Dune 2, the second half of Villeneuve's Dune, based on the Frank Herbert series. Now, I need to start by saying that I've read the entire series twice. That's everything from Dune to Chapterhouse Dune. If you want to see the list of all the books in order, look down in the information box below. As far as the movie goes, I hated it. And that is not to say it wasn't visually beautiful. It was a gorgeous movie. The cinematography was great. There were some great ideas there. But it was ruined by Chani. What a big pile of dog shit that character turned out to be. I like watching the books that I love dearly come to life in screenplay, just like I like comic book movies. I can accept some bending of the story. I mean, it is expected. It is based on the books. I cannot endorse the level of bending that came with something like Foundation, because that was what Apple TV did to Foundation was a complete travesty. And the same thing goes for Villeneuve's Dune. I had reservations with the first movie that came out. I enjoyed it, but I saw it veering off into areas that I would dislike, such as the gender bending and the race bending of Liet Kynes, and sort of like the weepy nature of Jessica. But in many ways it was spot on, so I was able to enjoy episode 1 without much reservation. I could forgive the things that happened or that they introduced to modernize the movie. However, what happened in Dune Part 2 was completely unnecessary. It was garbage, and it was such a deviation from the original Frank Herbert book that nobody knows where it's going, because frankly, by the end of it, I'm thinking that Chani is about to become an honored martyr, and that doesn't make any sense. Okay, let's start at the beginning. This is my issue. Chani was a complete feminist. She was a complete I am independent, woman is strong, hear me roar feminist, which is exactly opposite of what Frank Herbert wrote about Chani. Chani was beloved. Chani was a warrior, yes, granted that, but she was also feminine, and she was very lovely, and she loved Paul, and she was central to many of the themes that took place in the movie. So basically, I'm just going to itemize a few things that just disgusted me in the movie, and basically send your thoughts down in the comment section, because I can't be the only one who's read the series and then saw this complete bullshit. And one thing I'm glad of is that I didn't go to the movies and pay for this shit. I'm glad that I waited for it to come out on streaming services to watch it, because by all of the reviews that I've read about the movie, they were read. I didn't read. I watched videos on the reviews, and people were talking about how this was a shining example of how movie making should be done, and how great the story was, and the love affair between Chani and Paul Atreides, yada, 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 yada. And those things are great because, yes, they did have a great love affair. And, focusing on that would be good because Chani was also central to Paul's character. She was also central to what happens in the preceding books. To understand Dune, you have to understand the culture in which it is set, the cultures, shall I say. With that, there's a deep-seated religion that permeates the entire universe of Dune. And of course, it finds its origins in earth religions such as Buddhism, some Islam, obviously, Christianity, definitely. And Frank Herbert mentioned many things, even some of the Gnostic faiths, and secular existentialism, some of the names such as Zinsuni or Churuk are some of the words that you may find in the appendix of book 1 as Frank Herbert is discussing some of his ideas on the writing of the Dune saga. The danger of a charismatic leader is ever present in the Dune series, and most pronounced in Dune 1. Paul's reluctance, though, was found in the movie. It was cringe how he was taking sides with Chani, and it diminished his character greatly, because when I say that Chani brought the entire movie down, is that she undermined culture, or the character undermined the culture. The unity of purpose and their near fanatical following of what the Bene Gesserit had laid down before them was part of their mystique, and it was one of the things that really spoke to what Frank Herbert was trying to say. These fanatical regimes of Fremen were the exact opposite of the Sardaukar, although both were born out of hardship. And the thing about the Fremen is that they were susceptible because of their unity of purpose. When Chani became the raving, super independent young versus old, and y'all are the old Southern Fremen, and how they looked at him as antiquated, yet they were fighting alongside of him, the spirit of this just took away from what I expected to see, the entire idea of the Fremen and their unity of purpose, because you have to have unity of purpose and a massive amount of discipline to achieve what they had achieved, especially making all of those water retreats in their long-term goal of turning Arrakis into a paradise, which was also furthered by Liet Kynes. This fanatical unity of purpose is what made them so dangerous, and death was around every door. I mean, we're talking about very traditional roles that the males and the females had. There were lines in there that talked to us about how women stayed at the sietch and looked after the children while the men often traveled and fought, or how women would collect the moisture from these little moisture collectors, and how tedious a task it was, and yet they took all of this moisture to their little hidden retreats to fill those pools to achieve this long-term dream of creating a paradise out of Arrakis. Villeneuve's version of Chani undermined all of that. I mean, it just made no sense, and in many ways it undermined Stilgar. Paul was also undermined by the character. I mean, like her slapping him in the face. Chani would never have done that. She adored Paul, number one, and number two, she was submissive to her man as she became Paul's concubine. So I'm going to go ahead and point out some things, like some of the swaps that did not make any sense. Like early on, when Jessica was with Stilgar, she actually shed tears when she saw the large pools of water that they were collecting, and the enormity of the task that the Fremen had undergone. Again, this pointed to their great focus, their long discipline, and their unity of purpose in achieving such a monumental goal. And the fact that she was the one to give water to the dead instead of Paul Atreides, who gave water to Janus after he was killed, that he was killed by Paul in their duel. That diminished Paul in such a way, and it was completely unnecessary for Jessica to give water to the dead as a Bene Gesserit, because number one, it just seemed out of place. It didn't make any sense to me. So while that was not Chani who was diminishing Paul, that was a writing choice made by Villeneuve, and I don't think it was a wise one, because those of us who read that, it was part of the prophecy that Paul Atreides would give water to the dead, because crying was not something that the Fremen did. Now I'm going to go ahead and move on to Chani, because shortly after that, they're out in the sand, and Chani and her little cackling girlfriend, they begin, of course, talking about the Fremen from the south and how they're religious nuts and yada 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 yada. It was just a bad look, because everybody knows, well, anybody who's read the story knows, that Chani was 10 toes down for the Fremen. It didn't matter where those Fremen were from, because there were times when she had to defend Paul herself. Because what a lot of people don't know, if you hadn't read the book, Jameis had a wife and he had children. And when Paul killed Jameis, then Jameis's wife became, basically, she was supposed to become Paul's lover, and Jameis's children were to become Paul's children. And the children fiercely defended Paul, also getting in duels and killing people, or the men who wanted to challenge Paul. And these are the things that took place in the Siege. This was part of the death that's surrounding them and the hierarchy that exists in the Siege. So this idea that Chani and her girlfriend will be sitting off in the sand cackling was just ridiculous. And it spoke to the modern nonsense that men like me are just tired of seeing in movies where, super bad woman and she's cackling and men are stupid, because that's what happened shortly after that scene. Chani and her cackling friend are arguing with the men about Jessica, who was in the spice trance after she had taken the water of life. And, one was saying she was faking, and the older man, Stilgar, was telling them that he was saying that it was part of the prophecy. And then Paul goes and sides with Chani, which was completely out of character, because Paul at this point is trying to win over the Fremen. So therefore, siding with his girlfriend was completely out of character for Paul from the books. And I must say, in the movie also, because Paul is definitely changed from part 1 to part 2. I don't see that much consistency, but then again, it wasn't really Paul's story in part 1, so I can't really say that much. Mostly that was about the fall of the Atreides, and so the story was central to mostly his father. In part 1, part 2, we get into the Fremen and then Paul's ascension as the Kwisatz Haderach. However, when I compare Paul's character in those types of scenes to the book, they just don't match. And yes, I understand I'm committing a cardinal sin by comparing the movie to the book, but we were supposed to get a Dune that we could be proud of, and that had never been done before. And we get this neo-modern feminist garbage. But I will go on. Because after Paul sides with Chani, we get to this scene where Stilgar is being portrayed as an idiot with his older men. And, they're trying to, basically rationalize what Paul is doing. But it was set up. That scene was shot to make them look completely ridiculous, and to elevate Chani's character, played by Zendaya. That was one of the many shots across the bow that made me hate the movie, but I'm going to go on. The second thing in lacking in the unity of purpose and the 10 toes down Chani of the books versus the super independent dumbass that is Chani in the movie, it was that she was also like the water bearer. Now, there was a spice orgy in the book, And Chani was the one who was in charge of the water of life. So when Jessica took the water of life in the book, Chani was the one who gave it to her. And this was also during the spice orgy, also known as Tao. Now I'm going to read one of the lines from the book when Jessica was taking the water of life, because Jessica was reluctant. She knew it was poison, but she had to convert that poison into something safe for everybody else to drink in order to become a Reverend Mother, because it was the weakened or turned version of the water of life that was given to the rest of the CH to start the spice orgy. And it reads, "What is it?" Jessica asked herself. "Liquor? A drug?" She bent over the spout and smelled the esters of cinnamon, remembering then the drunkenness of Duncan, Idaho. Spice liquor, she asked herself. She took the siphon tube in her mouth and pulled up only the most minuscule sip. It tasted of the spice, a faint bite, acrid on the tongue. Chani pressed down on the skin bag. A great gulp of the stuff surged into Jessica's mouth, and before she could help herself, she swallowed it, fighting to retain her calmness and dignity. "To accept a little death is worse than death itself," Chani said. She stared at Jessica, waiting, and Jessica stared back, still holding the spout in her mouth. She tasted the sack's contents in her nostrils, in the roof of her mouth, in her cheeks, in her eyes, a biting sweetness, now cool. Again, Chani sent the liquid gushing into Jessica's mouth, delicate. This passage from the book exemplified Chani's duties in the CH, the fact that she held some importance there, and her responsibility as part of the transition from one Reverend Mother to the next. And the fact that she had such poetic words such as "to accept a little death is worse than death itself." This is the all-in nature of the Fremen, the fanatical faith that they have in themselves and in their prophecy. I mean, that's what this was all about. Stark contrast from the super independent dumbass Chani of Villeneuve's Dune. But I will go on, because the undisciplined nonsense by Chani and her cohorts doesn't stop there. In the cultural part of, the CH versus the city life, Arakeen, which was supposed to be a bustling city, a trade city, but I digress. We learn later in the book that the women don't commonly go out with the men in combat. That's is usually only when they're traveling from one CH to the other. That's what I'm finding out. And yes, they were fierce fighters as well as the children, because everybody learned to fight with a knife. However, when it came to open warfare, it was primarily the men out there doing the combat. And this spoke of the CH in the entire life and death cycle that existed there, not just from violence from within, with all of their, honor combat, which is what, we saw with Jameis, but also life from without as they fought the Harkonnens. So that passage is exemplified in the book with these passages. And this is when Chani came to visit Paul while they were out on the desert. And again, he's away doing what the men do, and she's back at the CH. This is after they had sex and their son was already born. This was Leto the second who was born. And the passage goes like this. I have talked about it. This is when Paul was asking Chani about her feelings and what's going on with the CH. She says, I have talked about it. The CH is a lonely place without our men. It's a place of work. We labor in the factories and the potting rooms. There are weapons to be made, poles to plant, and we may forecast the weather, spice to collect for the bribes. There are dunes to be planted, to make them grow and to anchor them. There are fabrics and rugs to make, fuel cells to charge. There are children to train, that the tribe's strength may never be lost. Is nothing then pleasant in the sietch? He asked. The children are pleasant. We observe the rites. We have sufficient food. Sometimes one of us may come north to be with her man. Life must go on. This is a shining example of life in the sietch, not this mumbo jumbo about women going out and then doing combat alongside the men. And this is why Chani was so beloved, because her strength came from doing her duties just as the male strength came from doing theirs. A sietch cannot exist with the kind of mumbo jumbo that Villeneuve's version of Chani exemplified. It was ridiculous. And again, it pointed to the nonsense that I'm just so tired of seeing in movies, because it was just bad writing, number one. And number two, he's building on an already established piece of work that is beloved worldwide. And to completely strip her was to bring down the whole project. But let me continue before I start really ranting. I mean, after Paul had taken the water of life, and then Chani slapped him in the face saying that he was doing something stupid, or that pissed me off to no end. The relationship between Jessica and Chani, which was very warm in the books, was cold and very, I wouldn't say antagonistic, but it was definitely, there was definitely enmity between them. And that made no sense either. I mean, Chani made no sense, and she brought the entire movie down. I just could not stand it. And, and while he focused on the love story was even contentious. And Chani's love story with Paul was something that spanned, I think, like 3 books. Not directly, but in the book Children of Dune, Jessica often spoke of the genetic compatibility between Paul and Chani and how uncanny it was, because of their genetic compatibility that Leto the third and Ghanima, the twins, also had prescient ability, along with the spice diet and being on Arrakis, because Arrakis was a death trap. Once you take in the spice, once you become addicted to melange, there was no escape for it outside of death. That was the death spiral that existed on Arrakis. Water was life, spice was death, and the sandworm was the medium between the two. Because how did you get water of life? You found a sand trout. And they showed this in the movie. You found a sand trout. You take the sand trout and you drown it in water. After it dies, what happens? It creates that blue vial of the water of life, which of course is used to start the spice orgy, as well as to transfer the prescient memory from one Reverend Mother to the next. The last thing I'm going to say about this is that Chani was greatly diminished, because Zendaya's Chani was a complete dumbass. The Chani of Frank Herbert was very smart, very bright. She was politically aware, although she did not fully understand the great houses and all of the politics surrounding it. However, she was not stupid by any stretch of the word. She understood that, like Jessica, she was to be Paul's concubine. And although she wanted him as a husband, that was completely there. She knew that her relationship with Paul was greater than the title of being a wife. And that is exemplified in the book at the very end. Because at the end of the movie, Chani got pissed off when Paul took Irulan as his wife in order to, of course, become the emperor. However, that's not what happened. And the book's Chani understood, because she was a bright girl. And I'm just going to read the passage. It goes, Jessica nodded, feeling suddenly old and tired. She looked at Chani. And for the royal concubine, no title for me, Chani whispered. Nothing, I beg of you. Paul stared down into her eyes, remembering her suddenly, as she had stood once with little Leto in her arms. Their child, now dead in this violence. I swear to you now, he whispered, that woman over there will be my wife, and you but a concubine, because this is a political thing and we must wield peace out of this moment and list the great houses of the Landsraad. We must obey the forms, yet that princess shall have no more of me than my name, no child of mine, nor touch, nor softness of glance, nor instance of desire. So you say now, Chani said. She glanced across the room at the tall princess. Do you know so little of my son, Jessica whispered. See that princess standing there, so haughty and confident? They say that she has pretensions of a literary nature. Let us hope that she finds solace in such things. She'll have little else. A bitter laugh escaped Jessica. Think on it, Chani. That princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know a moment of tenderness from the man to whom she is bound. While we, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives. That is such a potent closing to this, because it spoke more so of the power of union between men and women and not the title, something that plagues us today, because women are seeking titles and not the relationship that they would have with the men that they are with. And that is such a gross miscalculation by women. Chani almost made this error, but Jessica in the book, having been a concubine, knows that this is true. In the movie, when Zendaya looks over at Princess Irulan and then looks over at Paul Atreides and then decides to just run off like a petulant child on her own and, to summon a sandworm to go off on her zesty adventures of angry desert woman bitch whose man betrayed her by marrying somebody out of political aims, that diminished her character so greatly that I just wanted to vomit. I was like, this is bullshit. It diminished the entire story. Her petulance, it diminished the entire, culture of the Fremen. It just made everything just garbage. And so I'm not going to ramble on much longer about this. I mean, I think I've made it clear that I dislike the movie, and not because of the comparison to the book, but it's just because the character was so badly written, and that type of character is something that we get too much of today. It's ridiculous. She was basically a man. Paul Atreides might as well have been gay, because Chani was every bit a goddamn man. So I will end with this. I'm not going to watch that garbage anymore. There was no need for me to go back and look at it, because in doing this review, I find myself getting heated just thinking about the nonsense. Anyway, I will be doing more reviews, but most of my reviews will come from anime, because that's what I watch the most. But I wanted to do this review because, like Rings of Power, and I am a Tolkien fan, I am also a very big Frank Herbert fan. And what Villeneuve did to this series is just unforgivable by ruining such an important character across the breadth of these books. I would like to mention some things that are, I think, basically ruined. I mean, let's say they go on with the series, they could maybe patch up the relationship between Chani and Paul Atreides, because the twins are too important to the rest of the series. I mean, God Emperor was actually Leto III, who was the son of Chani and Paul. Chani also had limited prescient ability, and she protected Ghanima from becoming an abomination. One thing that needs to be mentioned as well is that it wasn't Paul who killed the Baron Harkonnen. It was Alia who killed the Baron Harkonnen, and Alia was, of course, Paul's sister, and she was the one who was preborn, and she was the one who was when Jessica went into the spice trance. And we saw her speaking to Paul when he was in his spice trance, in a prescient memory or dream, or the mind's link. Something happened, but it's as he was standing next to the ocean. That was Aaliyah talking to him. So Aaliyah, for her part in Children of Dune, she gets possessed by the Baron, and he goes off on many escapades sexually with her body. So we begin to understand what abomination is and what it looks like, and the struggle for those who have prescient memory to keep down all of the voices of the past. So I'm going to end it there, and I hope you enjoyed this rant. If you got comments, leave them in the section below. See you next time.